The story begins as Cyan recalls the words his father always imparted to him. Dedicate your life to uphold the honor of the family name. Those words had always echoed in Cyan's mind, a constant reminder of his place in the world. What his father meant by them was clear. Cyan's sole purpose was to serve his older brother, to remain at his side like a shadow, without ambition or desire of his own. It was a role Cyan had long accepted, though the weight of it never quite left him. Now, in the chaos of the battlefield, the memory resurfaces. Surrounded by knights in white capes, swords drawn, Cyan crumples to his knees. His shoulders sag under the heavy burden of his thoughts, and his head hangs low, his hair falling over his face, hiding the torment behind his eyes. As several knights closed in around him, the sound of footsteps rang out across the battlefield. An unknown figure appeared, radiating an air of condescension, an arrogance too grand to be witnessed by just anyone. Cyan remained silent, blood trickling down his cheeks and pooling at the corner of his lips. His eyes remained hidden, obscured by the dark curtain of his hair. Cyan, a lone knight, stood resolute against the continent's fiercest warriors. The battlefield was littered with fallen knights, some barely able to rise. One knight gritted his teeth in frustration, clutching his wounded arm as blood stained the ground and the unconscious lay scattered across the field. Amidst the chaos, one man remained untouched. His knight's robe was pristine, his hands casually tucked behind his back as he watched with a sly smile. "How marvelous. You truly are his younger brother," he said, his voice dripping with condescension as he loomed over Lord Cyan Vert. Hearing those vulgar words, Cyan finally raised his gaze to see the man in the pristine robe. With a bitter mutter, he spoke the name, Boris. Boris, the head of the Empire's Magic Society, one of the core powers behind the Empire's darkness, working alongside the Knights of Light. Despite his distaste for the man's actions, Cyan refrained from considering him a direct threat. After all, Boris had once served as his brother's right hand. But now, seeing him here, doing this, it only deepened Cyan's confusion and disdain. The battlefield fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Boris's maniacal laughter and the smug grin on his face. Then, without warning, a dark mist coiled around Cyan's hand as he conjured a short dagger. He knew, deep down, that Boris had played a part in his downfall, and the truth only fueled the rage simmering within him. The black mist swirling from the dagger began to envelop Cyan, its dark tendrils creeping over him as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. His eyes remained hidden, shrouded by the curtain of his hair, yet there was a quiet resolve in the way he moved. Boris raised his arm to shield his face as the powerful aura radiated from Cyan. He couldn't hide his disgust, muttering that Cyan's black fog was sickening. Yet, as he observed the raw power before him, a dark realization settled in. This was exactly as the rumors had described. Cyan rose to his feet, his stance unwavering and defiant, as the dark aura surged around him. The ground beneath him cracked and trembled, unable to contain the sheer force of his power, while debris swirled in the air like a violent storm. His eyes, now glowing crimson, gleamed with deadly intent. Cyan was no mere warrior. He was an assassin of the mist. Unable to suppress his unease, Boris remarked that this mist truly was a fog, one that cast a shadow over their order of light. As the dark mist slowly encroached upon him, he realized with a sense of urgency that he needed to report back, claiming that he had eliminated the heretical rebel. Dried blood stained Cyan's face as he dropped into an offensive stance, his body coiled and ready to strike. He dared Boris to speak of his powers to the Order of Light. With a threatening sneer, he spat that Boris could try, if he still had a mouth left to speak. Boris shifted into a defensive stance, though his smug smile faltered as sweat betrayed his unease. He warned Cyan that if he intended to use his secret technique, it would be pointless. With a cold smirk, he revealed, "A 9th star magic barrier has been cast around this area. You're trapped." In his mind, Cyan knew he had to escape and expose the true culprit to his brother. As he continued to channel more mana, the air around him thickened with power. Boris stood frozen, his eyes widening as he watched Cyan's strength surge. With a fierce glare, Cyan raised his dagger to his face, preparing to strike. His voice was calm but unwavering as he declared, "I'll pierce through this barrier." Suddenly, the thick tension in the air was broken as a man clad in gleaming gold and silver armor strode past Boris. Without hesitation, Boris stepped aside, his smug demeanor vanishing. Bowing deeply, he placed a hand over his chest in deference to the imposing figure. Cyan's focused demeanor faltered as his gaze locked onto the approaching figure. His eyes widened in confusion. This was no stranger. The man's presence tugged at memories buried deep within Cyan's mind, accompanied by the echo of his father's words. "Dedicate your life to upholding the honor of the family name. Your brother Ashel is the family's pride. His success is your success." The man in golden and silver armor stood tall, his blonde hair catching the light, his expression utterly devoid of emotion. Ashel's piercing gaze settled on Cyan, his eyes narrowing as if dissecting every detail, every flaw of his younger brother. Cyan's mind churned, the shocking revelation leaving his legs unsteady. The truth was unbearable. The man behind the attack was none other than his brother, Ashel. He couldn't bring himself to believe it. Ashel continued his slow, deliberate approach, his presence towering like a colossus in the radiant golden and silver armor that gleamed with authority. In his hand, a golden sword glimmered faintly, its aura casting an almost ethereal glow, amplifying the weight of his approach. The sight of his brother standing against him drained the strength from Cyan's legs, sending him collapsing to the ground. The dark aura that had once surrounded him dissipated in an instant, leaving only a hollow silence. Ashel, his voice devoid of emotion, stared down at his brother's pitiful state. His cold, chilling tone cut through the air as he remarked, "I see it in your eyes. You don't understand why I'm here." Ashel stood just a few feet away, his towering presence casting a shadow over Cyan, making him appear small and powerless by comparison. Cyan slowly lifted his gaze, his voice unsteady as he asked, "What is the meaning of this?" Ashel's face remained an unfeeling mask, his voice chillingly calm as he responded, "You've served your purpose well, for the clan, for the people, and for me." The weight of those words struck Cyan like a blow, sinking deep into his chest. In that instant, the truth became undeniable. He knew exactly what was about to happen. Ashel understood all too well that for decades, Cyan had borne the heavy burden of his duty. Now he had come to relieve Cyan of that weight. But before he could act, Cyan's dark aura ignited once more, surging with an intensity that filled the air. The oppressive energy caught Ashel off guard, and for the first time, the cold detachment in his expression cracked, giving way to a flicker of surprise. Cyan tightened his grip on the hilt of his dagger as the dark aura around him pulsed with renewed intensity. Confusion and anguish swirled within him. His voice, trembling with desperation, broke the tense silence. "Did I do something wrong?" Ashel's eyes narrowed as he repeated Cyan's question, his tone sharp and unforgiving. Regaining his composure, he spoke coldly. "The sinister fog enveloping you tells me everything I need to know. You are no longer human, Cyan. You're nothing more than a vile murderer." Cyan lowered his head, unable to meet his brother's gaze. Ashel's words struck him like a blade, cutting deeper than any wound. He remained silent, the weight of his brother's condemnation pressing down on him. Ashel's voice rose with fury as he continued, his tone sharp and accusatory. "You've been deceiving everyone, Cyan." Anger flared as he pointed an accusing finger at him. "Do you truly claim not to know the heinous sins you're guilty of?" Cyan's expression darkened, his brother's cruel words echoing relentlessly in his mind. Murderer? Heinous crimes? His face twisted in anger, the fury boiling over. "How dare you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. The accusation burned deeper as memories surfaced. Someone else had once said something similar, that a life spent serving others was the most futile existence of all. But Cyan had rejected that notion and devoted himself entirely to a shell. Through his sacrifices, he had helped his brother achieve everything. The struggle for the imperial throne, the suppression of the demon army, the war for continental unification, and more. He had stood as a hero, a savior, the sole protector of the continent, all for a shell. To Cyan, he had been everything his brother needed and more. And now, with those bitter accusations ringing in his ears, the question clawed at him. Was it all truly futile? Cyan's fist slammed into the ground with a brutal force, his anger radiating through his entire being. He could feel the earth tremble beneath his strike, but it did nothing to quell the storm inside him. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his body trembling with fury as he realized the cold truth. Ishel was abandoning him. The dark aura that had simmered within him began to ooze from his body, thick and suffocating, swirling around him like a living thing. His rage fueled it, and as the fog grew denser, it became a tangible manifestation of his hurt and betrayal. For 20 years, he had toiled like a servant under a shell, doing everything to ensure his brother's success, believing that his efforts were for the greater good. Now, that same brother stood before him as his enemy. Blood began to pool at Cyan's feet, trickling down from wounds he hadn't even noticed. But he didn't care. His body, torn and broken, was nothing. He had decided he would give everything he had, even if it meant destroying a shell in the process. The crimson mist erupted from him, engulfing the entire area in a sea of red. The sky above seemed to bleed as the fog painted it with the color of fury. The knights watching in stunned silence were paralyzed, their eyes wide with disbelief. They couldn't fathom that Cyan still had this much power left in him, as if the very essence of his being was a force they could no longer control. It was impossible. No human could wield such power, the knights thought bitterly. The hero, the man he once admired, was now trying to kill his own younger brother out of sheer fear. His voice rang out in a harsh, accusing tone as he asked, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, Ishel?" The words struck deep, and Ishel's face contorted with fury. Veins popped along his temples, a visible sign of his growing rage. Without warning, Cyan launched himself forward with astonishing speed, a blur of motion as he relentlessly assaulted his brother. Ishel fought back, desperately swinging his sword in an attempt to deflect each strike. But Cyan wasn't looking for a battle of endurance. He was waiting for one moment, one single opportunity. Just once, that was all he needed, to find Ishel's weak spot and pierce it, stopping his brother from regenerating. The fight raged on, Cyan's body moving with precision, his every attack calculated. He could feel it. This was the moment. But as his blade rushed forward, it collided with an invisible force, a magic barrier. Cyan skidded to a halt, shock coursing through him. He hadn't expected his strongest strike to be blocked so easily. His eyes scanned the battlefield, and that's when he saw it. Boris, standing at Ishel's side, his magic fueling the barrier. Ishel sneered at him, his voice dripping with disdain. "You poor bastard," he muttered coldly, as if Cyan's struggle were beneath him. Ishel's sword plunged into Cyan's stomach, and with a sickening twist, it made Cyan's grip on his dagger falter, the weapon falling from his hand. The pain seared through him, but it was nothing compared to the cold words that followed. "I wanted to offer you a painless death, Cyan, since you're my brother," Ishel said, his voice chilling. "But you've shown me your true nature." He paused, his eyes hardening as he continued. "I knew from the start that you were a demon. It's a good thing I never trusted you." Cyan's face fell, the weight of Ishel's betrayal sinking deep into his heart. His chest tightened, and the pain from the wound became a distant ache compared to the raw agony in his soul. He had devoted his life to this man, his brother, only to be cast aside so easily. With a callous sneer, Ishel kicked Cyan aside, twisting the sword deeper to remove it from his body. The movement was cruelly deliberate, and Cyan collapsed to the ground, his blood pooling beneath him. Eshel turned away without a second glance, leaving Cyan broken and bleeding, alone in the silence of his betrayal. As Cyan lay there, blood pooling around him, he couldn't help but reflect on how foolish his life had been. The years spent in servitude, the endless sacrifices for a brother who now cast him aside. It all seemed so pointless. His mind grew fuzzy, and as darkness crept in, he called himself stupid for ever believing in Eshel. But then, a surge of adrenaline shot through him. With what little strength he had left, Cyan pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling with pain, but his resolve hardening. He chased after Eshel's retreating figure, driven by a final, desperate instinct. Eshel turned as he sensed Cyan's movement, but it was too late. Cyan's hand shot out, his dagger aimed directly at his brother's throat. A scream tore from his lungs as he poured all of his remaining power into that single lethal strike. The blade was mere inches from Eshel's throat when a sudden, overwhelming force sent Cyan flying backward. His body crashed to the ground, and the world around him blurred into darkness. When he awoke, he was gasping for air, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. The sound of a voice calling young Master Cyan snapped him back to reality. He blinked, disoriented, and realized he was back in his bed. The maid was standing by his side, frowning. "You're late, young master." "Sleeping in again," she scolded. The reality of the moment hit him like a wave. Had it all been a dream? The maid's voice snapped him back to the present, her tone sharp as she told him to get his act together and prepare himself. He blinked in confusion, his mind still reeling from the dream, or nightmare, he couldn't tell. When he looked up, he was startled to see Emily standing before him. "What are you doing here?" Cyan asked, his voice betraying his surprise. Emily seemed just as taken aback, her eyes wide. But then, a realization struck him like a sudden jolt. It had been 20 years since he last saw her, yet she hadn't changed at all. She still looked the same, as though no time had passed. His gaze wandered, and that's when it hit him. Everything around him was exactly as he remembered. The room, the furniture, even the arrangement of it all, was the same as when he was a child. For a brief, disorienting moment, he wondered if he had somehow returned to his younger self, to a time before everything went wrong. "Are you stalling, Cyan?" Emily's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and teasing. "Do you not want to go to training?" She gave him a pointed look, clearly expecting an answer. Emily's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts as she instructed him to make up his mind and get moving. Cyan blinked at her, utterly bewildered. "Training? What training are you talking about?" he asked, his tone edged with uncertainty. Her brows furrowed at his question, and for a moment, she looked as if she might scold him again. But Cyan barely noticed her reaction. His gaze wandered around the room, and the realization sank deeper. This was the Vert clan duchy of the past. A chill ran down his spine. Was this what people meant when they said your life flashes before your eyes before death? Was he reliving a fragment of his memories in his final moments? The scene around him began to stir long-buried recollections. It was 27 years ago, during the Foundation year 985, on March 1st. That year marked the annual duel training session held by the duchy, a significant event that gathered attention from the entire household. His father, Duke Vert, always attended, making it an occasion of great importance. Cyan's opponent in that training session had been Cran's Vert, his half-brother. The memory sharpened, and he could see Cran's clearly in his mind's eye, a boy his own age, brimming with determination and skill. Cran's was the son of Margaret Argaeus, the Duke's wife and the Duchess of Vert. The rivalry between them, fueled by their respective positions within the family, had begun long before this particular day, but it was this duel that had set the tone for years to come. Because of that duel, Cran's had garnered far more attention than Cyan, despite both being the youngest in the family. The difference was stark. Cyan was the bastard son, a child born outside the Duke's official marriage. The humiliation of that fight cemented his position as an object of ridicule among the household and beyond. Even worse, it was after that very duel that his father ceased paying him any meaningful attention. Cyan had become invisible, overshadowed by his half-brother's growing prestige. In the present moment, Emily leaned closer and whispered softly, "Perhaps you should surrender." The words struck a nerve. Young Cyan had shaken his head then, brushing her suggestion aside. "It's okay," he had said with forced confidence. "I just need to win." But deep down, her words had stung. To Cyan, it felt as though even she doubted him, as though she too thought he was destined to fail. He adjusted his grip on the rapier in his hand. Something felt off. The weapon was heavy, far heavier than he remembered it being. That's when it hit him. His strength, his agility, even the way his body moved. It was the same as it had been back then, in his younger years. A creeping sense of unease settled over him. This didn't feel like a dream, nor a memory playing out as his life flashed before his eyes. The sensations were too vivid, the weight of the weapon too real. Whatever this was, it felt tangible, as if he had truly gone back to that time. Cyan's thoughts raced. He couldn't recall any magic spell capable of producing illusions this vivid, this real. The air felt heavy with anticipation, the murmurs of the gathered crowd tangible in his ears. He couldn't shake the possibility. Was he truly back in the past? A familiar voice cut through his musings. "Surprised you didn't run off this time," Cran sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. Cyan's gaze flickered toward his half-brother, standing confidently with his sword at the ready. The taunt didn't sting as it once might have. Instead, it sparked something deeper in him, a realization. If this truly was the past, then maybe this was his chance to change the future. His father's voice boomed across the field, declaring the start of the match. The crowd fell silent, their focus narrowing on the two young competitors. Krantz wasted no time, lunging forward with confidence. "Where are you looking?" he jeered, his blade aimed directly at Cyan. His movements were bold and aggressive, but to Cyan, they seemed almost sluggish. He couldn't help but smirk inwardly. Kranz was like a snail in his eyes. Cyan adjusted his stance ever so slightly, shifting his weight with practiced ease. As Kranz's sword arced toward him, Cyan took a single step to the side, the movement precise and fluid. Kranz's blade swished harmlessly through the air, the momentum of his strike carrying him off balance. His eyes widened in shock as he realized he had missed. The crowd murmured in surprise, but Cyan didn't even flinch. He simply watched Kranz, his mind already calculating his next move. Kranz's frustration boiled over, his face twisting with anger. "Dodging like a coward, are you?" he spat, his voice trembling with indignation. But before he could make another move, Cyan struck. With a quick, precise motion, he hit Kranz's hand, sending his sword flying through the air. The clatter of metal on stone echoed across the field, drawing gasps from the onlookers. Cyan didn't stop there. He followed up with a swift kick to Kranz's shin, the force of the blow sending his half-brother crumpling to the ground. Kranz groaned in pain, clutching his knees and writhing on the dirt. His mother's panicked voice broke through the tension. "Kranz!" she cried, her worry palpable as she leaned forward in alarm. Cyan's gaze remained cold and unyielding as he watched the scene unfold. His thoughts raced, his grip tightening on the hilt of his rapier. Now, he thought, if I put my sword to his throat, the duel is over. It would be the simple and honorable thing to do. But something held him back. His chest burned with old memories, raw and unforgotten. He recalled the years of torment Kranz had inflicted on him, how his half-brother's cruel bullying had been a daily ordeal, a twisted form of amusement that extended even into their academy days. Cyan's resolve hardened. No, this isn't enough, he thought bitterly. If I don't break him here and now, he'll never stop. His eyes darkened as he raised his blade, determination surging through him. I'll make sure he never dares to humiliate me again. Cyan had resolved that in this life, he would carve his own path, free from the shadows of others. His determination had been made clear in the duel's outcome. Across the field, Cran lay trembling, his face streaked with tears, his pride shattered along with his composure. The verdict was undeniable. Cran had lost. Shortly after, the Duke summoned Cyan to his study, even clearing his schedule for the meeting. This unexpected gesture left Cyan curious. Was my victory really that significant? He wondered. A high-ranking knight named Jurkin, one of the Duke's personal retainers, was tasked with escorting him. As they made their way through the grand halls of the Vert estate, Cyan encountered Margaret Argaeus, Cran's mother. Her face was stormy, her frustration palpable. It seemed she had just come from a heated discussion with the Duke about her son's humiliating defeat. Cyan couldn't resist. A sly grin tugged at his lips as he approached her. "Lady Margaret," he said, feigning innocence, "is Cran's all right?" Her fury flared instantly. She turned on him, her voice sharp and cutting. "How dare you ask me that?" she snapped, her tone venomous. "After the disgraceful way you humiliated your brother, you've got the audacity to ask if he's all right?" As Cyan walked away, Margaret Argaeus' voice followed him, sharp and venomous. "Thick-skinned, aren't you?" she sneered, brushing past him. "But I suppose that's just how duels are." Her words carried a deliberate sting, each syllable dripping with disdain. Then she muttered, loud enough for him to hear, "This is why bastards shouldn't be treated like legitimate children." Cyan paused mid-step, his back stiffening. Margaret wasn't done. With a devilish grin, she added, "Like mother, like son. Your mother was nothing more than a dirty whore, after all." The insult burned in his ears, but before he could respond, she twisted the knife further. "You should be out on the streets, begging for scraps, not standing here daring to act as though you belong. You should have known better than to put up a fight. You should have been grateful." Cyan turned slowly, his gaze locking onto hers with a cold, murderous intensity. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His crimson eyes glowed faintly, a grim expression settling on his face as dark thoughts swirled in his mind. For a fleeting moment, Cyan weighed the idea of silencing Margaret's vile tongue permanently. He knew precisely how to make her suffer, slowly, meticulously, ensuring every ounce of pain was felt. The thought alone brought a chilling calm to his storming mind. Instead, he tilted his head, his voice sharp and mocking as he asked, "Are you aware that I'll be attending the academy with Cran's Duchess?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And what of it?" she snapped, her tone laced with suspicion. Cyan's smile was anything but kind. "I'm sure you'd want your precious son to graduate intact, with all his limbs, perhaps? Or maybe you're not as concerned about him as you claim. Is that it, Duchess?" Her fury erupted like a firestorm. "You vulgar piece of filth!" she spat, raising her hand to slap him. Before her palm could connect, a strong arm intercepted the blow. Jurkin, the high-class knight escorting Cyan, stepped in with an unwavering expression. "My apologies, Duchess," he said firmly, lowering her hand with calculated restraint. "The Duke has called for young Master Cyan urgently. We mustn't delay." Margaret's face twisted with rage, but she said nothing. The Duke's orders were absolute. Cyan peeked from behind Jurkin's imposing figure, a sly grin curling his lips. He was being shielded by one of the most steadfast knights in the duchy, a man who wouldn't bow even to the Duke's wife. Jurkin was a fortress, unyielding and reliable, and in that moment, Cyan found himself appreciating the knight's silent strength. The heavy doors creaked open. His authoritative voice resonated through the chamber. "Come in." Cyan stepped forward, his small frame straightening instinctively as he entered the room. He greeted the Duke respectfully, his tone steady despite the swirl of emotions beneath his composed exterior. As he stood there, memories surfaced. Memories of how long it had been since they last spoke alone. Nearly 15 years. 15 years since he had stood in the presence of this man, without the buffer of others. Duke Williers Vert was no ordinary noble. He was the formidable ruler of Velius, a western stronghold of the Wusif Empire. Yet the world knew him by a far greater title, the Guardian of the Continent. He was a legend, a hero who had held back the tides of demonic invasions with unmatched magical prowess and unparalleled wisdom. Duke Williers Vert bore a burden no one demanded of him, a responsibility he carried until his final breath on the battlefield against the Demon King's army. His singular wish was for peace to reign across the continent. But for Cyan, his memories of the Duke were far less noble. To him, this was a man who chose, of his own free will, to spend his entire life in servitude to ideals and others. A man who embraced that life willingly, never seeking more for himself. To Cyan, he was a fool. The Duke's deep voice broke the silence, pulling Cyan from his thoughts. Your eyes followed the sword precisely, tracking its path before you dodged. Cyan blinked, momentarily confused. The Duke elaborated, his tone analytical. When Crans charged at you, you didn't flinch. You looked directly at the arc of the blade and turned your body to avoid it perfectly. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze fixed on Cyan. So tell me, when did you learn to wield a sword? Cyan recognized that, as always, the Duke's perception was razor sharp. Choosing his words carefully, he answered, I wouldn't say I learned it. I practiced on my own, every night. The Duke's eyes narrowed. Practiced? On your own? You've never shown any interest in swordsmanship before. Why hide such remarkable skill? Heat crept into Cyan's cheeks. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, he admitted, though the excuse felt flimsy under the Duke's intense scrutiny. The Duke tilted his head slightly, unconvinced. An odd claim, considering you went all out to take down Crans in that duel. His voice carried a note of challenge as he added, Tell me, Cyan, do you believe what you did afterward was necessary? Cyan tensed. The Duke was undoubtedly referring to the moment he struck Crans while he was already down. The question carried a deliberate weight, as if the Duke were probing for a deeper truth. Cyan hesitated briefly before replying, I wanted to prove myself. The Duke leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. Prove what, exactly? With steady conviction, Cyan met his father's eyes. That I'm better than Crans, even though we share the same blood. That I can rise above him. The room was silent for a beat, save for the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Then, unexpectedly, the Duke chuckled, a deep, resonant sound that filled the space. Well said, the Duke remarked, his expression softening into something resembling approval. A clear and concise answer, showing both confidence and level-headedness. I didn't realize you were this capable, Cyan. The Duke's delight was palpable as he added, You'll make a fine and reliable support for a shell one day. Those words hit Cyan like a cold blade. The betrayal of his past life surged through his chest, an ache he struggled to suppress. In that moment, he realized that even in this second chance, his father's praise wasn't for him. It was for what he could offer to a shell. His grip on the present wavered, but he masked his emotions, knowing this was only the beginning. Cyan's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disappointment. He couldn't fathom why the Duke would suggest he become a shell's assistant, yet again. It was always the same. The Duke, with his unwavering obsession, had never truly seen Cyan for who he was, only as an extension of his shell's ambitions. His clenched fists betrayed his simmering frustration. The Duke, seemingly oblivious to the storm brewing within Cyan, smiled and offered, I want to reward you, Cyan. If there's anything you desire, anything at all, you need only ask. Cyan's eyes hardened as he locked onto the Duke, a cold resolve settling in his chest. He had heard enough. Everything a shell had worked for, everything he had strived to build, Cyan would tear it all down. I want to go to the battlefront, he declared, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable intensity. A few moments later, Emily entered the room. Upon hearing Cyan's request, her face drained of color, her shock evident. You want to go to the battlefront? She repeated, her voice trembling slightly. Cyan met her gaze, his expression resolute. Nothing is certain yet. Emily's concern deepened as she pressed further. Are you out of your mind? Do you even understand what kind of place that is? She warned him, her voice laced with concern, that the battlefront was infested with wicked, terrifying demonic beasts, creatures that roamed freely across the land. Velius, the western feud of the Wusif Empire, was the only place on the entire continent truly deserving of the title Battlefront. And within that, the Lamaya Valley stood as the ultimate front line, a blood-soaked battlefield where the war against demons had raged for centuries. The Duke, ever the stubborn man, had opposed sending anyone to that cursed place from the start. Yet, in his own way, he'd offered Cyan a condition, one that would grant him a chance to enter Lamaya Valley. He must prove himself worthy within 1 month. Cyan had no idea what standards the Duke would use to judge him, but he knew one thing. If he wanted to step foot on that hellish ground, he had to strengthen himself as much as possible in the time given. He was well aware of his own shortcomings. Despite his combat sense being sharper than most, his body was still weaker than that of his peers. But there was a glimmer of hope. The magic he'd once possessed stirred faintly within him, and that, coupled with the battle instincts that had followed him from his past life, could make all the difference. His plan was simple: train his body to its fullest potential, and he would use whatever advantages he had. Without wasting any more time, he resolved to begin his training immediately. Suddenly, the door to his room burst open with force. A woman stormed in, her presence commanding attention. It was Ellis, her blue hair and stern expression marking her as someone not easily intimidated. Without a word, she grabbed him by the collar, shaking him as if he were a rag doll. "Have you lost your mind?" she snapped, her voice cold and furious. Emily, appearing startled but composed, greeted Lady Ellis with respect. But Ellis paid her little attention, her focus entirely on Cyan as she shook him once more, demanding an explanation for his reckless behavior. Ellis had heard the rumors, how Cyan had asked their father to send him to the battlefront. She released him with a sharp shove, leaving him to crumble to the ground, his body feeling heavier than ever. It was as if his very soul had left him, drained by the weight of Ellis's gaze. "You think defeating Crans has made you invincible?" Ellis's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a whip. "Get up. We're going to the rooftop." Cyan barely processed her words as he pushed himself to his feet. The world seemed to blur around him, his mind still spinning from the chaotic events of the day. On the rooftop, Ellis wasted no time. Her eyes were cold, calculating. "Here's the deal," she began, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'll allow you to go to the battlefront, but only if you can endure my attacks for 3 minutes once we draw our swords." Cyan blinked in surprise. "Do we really need to go that far?" His voice was laced with confusion, unsure whether to laugh or be infuriated by the challenge. Ellis's expression hardened. "Yes, we do." Her eyes locked with his, unyielding. "Answer me truthfully. Are you after the family's title?" Internally, Cyan was taken aback. He hadn't considered that Ellis's actions were driven by such a motive, the title. He wasn't interested in it, not even the slightest bit. Yet her assumption, combined with her cold tone, made it clear that she saw this as the only reason behind his actions. His silence was all the confirmation Ellis needed. She turned, gesturing for him to draw his sword. Cyan felt a sigh build up in his chest as he unsheathed his blade. This had been a day of nothing but chaos. It hadn't even been half a day since his duel with Crans, and now he was expected to fight Ellis? He shook his head in frustration. "What a mess this day has turned out to be," he muttered to himself, preparing for whatever Ellis was about to throw at him. Ellis launched her attack without hesitation, catching Cyan off guard. But to her surprise, he managed to block her strike, something that should have been impossible for a 10-year-old. Ellis took a step back, her mind racing to process what had just happened. A rapier was a light weapon, designed for quick, precise strikes, not for blocking the heavy blow of a longsword. Yet somehow, Cyan had parried it cleanly. She paused, wondering if it had just been a stroke of luck. But the determination in his eyes told her otherwise. "You've got better instincts than I gave you credit for," she muttered, analyzing his form. Cyan could see from Ellis's sharp gaze that the situation was about to escalate. He had only bought himself a brief moment of respite. Without warning, Ellis pressed forward, her attacks coming faster and harder than before. Cyan stood his ground, meeting each blow with calculated precision. He parried her sword again, this time positioning his rapier with a quick flick that surprised them both, the blade parallel to her throat. Ellis froze for a split second, caught off guard by the unexpected turn of events. But before Cyan could capitalize on the opportunity, he felt the force of her next strike. With a burst of energy, she blasted him back, sending him flying into the air. He landed hard on top of a nearby pillar, gasping for breath. The world spun around him, his heart racing. His thoughts were chaotic. Had he not adjusted his grip on the sword midway through the strike, he would have ended the fight right then and there. But now, he was left with nothing but a sense of impending danger. The battle could still go terribly wrong. He landed hard on top of a nearby pillar, gasping for breath. The world spun around him, his heart racing. His thoughts were chaotic. Had he not adjusted his grip on the sword midway through the strike, he would have ended the fight right then and there. But now, he was left with nothing but a sense of impending danger. The battle could still go terribly wrong. Mist's swordsmanship, known as thick fog, was designed for one purpose: to land a killing blow. Cyan couldn't help but acknowledge the truth. Fighting without the intent to kill was becoming increasingly difficult, especially with his limited strength. His body ached from exertion, and though he was compensating for his lack of physical power by imbuing his rapier with mana, he could feel his energy waning. He wondered how much longer he could hold on before his strength gave out completely. Ellis was in no better state, her breath coming in ragged, labored gasps. She lowered her head, her blue hair falling in heavy bangs that obscured her eyes. But then, with a quiet determination, Ellis began to chant, summoning the power of the earth and the wind. Cyan's eyes widened as his sister's chants reached his ears. A surge of fear crossed his face, and he swallowed hard. His gaze snapped to Ellis. She was invoking a level 6 spell. In the blink of an eye, Ellis dropped into an offensive stance, one eye glowing with a piercing blue aura, her target locked in her gaze. The elements swirled around her dull sword, which began to shimmer with an ethereal, vibrant blue light. It was the high-level magic known as Aqua Blade. The sight of the magical blade only intensified Cyan's sense of looming doom. A wry, almost nervous expression crossed his face as he realized this was meant to be a test. He couldn't help but wonder, was Ellis truly planning to kill him? Ellis lost all composure, any semblance of reason vanishing in an instant. Her sole focus was the fear of defeat. Over and over, she murmured to herself, "I won't lose." Cyan could sense the grimness of the situation, realizing how dire it had become for him. Her eyes burned with an intense glow, clouding her judgment with a singular, dangerous determination. Cyan knew from the fierce glint in her eyes that this could very well be the end. His position on the edge of the pillar left little room for error. Even if he managed to block her attack, he was sure he'd be sent tumbling off. But he had a plan, one that was as risky as it was desperate. Trusting his instincts, he decided to act first. In a flash of speed, Cyan charged at her, closing the distance in an instant. Ellis, sensing his approach, thrust her sword toward the sky, channeling all her power into the blade. With a surge of blue mana, the sword erupted in a burst of energy, preparing for a devastating strike. Cyan knew this would be his only chance. If he could reach her before she fully unleashed her magic, he might just have a shot at surviving this encounter. Cyan gripped his sword tightly, his heart pounding in his chest as he silently begged for someone, anyone, to intervene. He could feel Ellis's power radiating from her, a force so intense it seemed to weigh down on him. Desperation filled Cyan as he silently prayed for Jurken's arrival, hoping he would intervene before the inevitable clash. As if answering his unspoken plea, a commanding shout echoed through the air. "Stop!" Just as Ellis and Cyan were about to collide, Jurkin appeared, leaping into the fray with his hand firmly gripping the hilt of his sword. With blinding speed, Jurkin intercepted Ellis's strike, his unsheathed sword meeting hers in a clash that erupted with a burst of blue energy. The air quaked as shock waves rippled outward, the sharp ring of metal against metal echoing through the field. Despite the explosive collision, Jurkin stood unmoved, his stance unyielding like a fortress. Without hesitation, he reached out and grabbed Cyan by the back of his neck, lifting him effortlessly off the ground as though the boy weighed nothing. His stern expression cut through the chaos as his piercing gaze locked onto Ellis. "Lady Ellis," he said, his voice steady, yet edged with authority. "You've gone too far. This was a test, not a battle to the death." His tone was firm, commanding respect, but beneath the discipline was a thread of concern. He chastised her, not merely as a superior, but as someone who cared. His words both a reprimand and a reminder of the line she had crossed. Dangling helplessly from Jurkin's grip, Cyan let out a long sigh of relief, his chest heaving as the tension slowly ebbed away. His mind raced, replaying the nerve-wracking moments when he had doubted whether Jurkin would ever arrive. For a fleeting, agonizing instant, he had believed he was utterly alone. Ellis gasped, as if snapping out of a trance, her eyes widening in dawning realization. Her mouth fell open as she took in the sight before her. Jurkin's unsheathed sword holding her blade at bay. The glow of mana around her weapon dimmed and faded, leaving her stunned and speechless. Without a word, Ellis rushed to Cyan, pulling him into a trembling embrace. Her arms quivered as she clung to him, her voice breaking with guilt-laden apologies. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her words spilling out in shaky, incoherent fragments. Tears brimmed in her eyes before spilling over, streaking down her face. Ellis's grip tightened unconsciously, drawing a strangled cough from Cyan. "Ellis, I can't breathe," he managed to croak. But she didn't let go. Her emotions poured out in a flood as her tears turned into sobs. Snot bubbled from her nose, yet she paid no mind to her disheveled state. Jurkin stood nearby, watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He made no move to interrupt, his neutral gaze betraying neither approval nor reproach as Ellis's raw emotions poured forth, unrestrained. "I just couldn't stand it," she cried, her voice cracking. "The thought of you going to the front lines, I couldn't bear it. I didn't know what I was doing. I lost control." Her words tumbled out between gasping sobs as she buried her face against him, clutching him as though letting go would shatter her world. Cyan smiled softly, touched by her outburst. He could never deny how much Ellis cared, always pouring herself fully into everything she did. Her determination, even when it caused her to break down, was something he could always count on. It was just like her. Cyan's older sister, Ellis, was the embodiment of excellence, an elite among elites. At the academy, renowned across the continent as the pinnacle of training in swordsmanship, magic, and academics, Ellis stood unrivaled. Among the most talented students, she reigned as an unmatched S-class prodigy, excelling effortlessly in every discipline. But Ellis's brilliance wasn't limited to her skills. Her beauty was as striking as her talent, earning her the title Godchild. Her long, flowing blue hair, partially braided, framed a face of flawless elegance, and her smile, radiant and warm, could brighten an entire room, leaving those around her captivated. From a young age, she was rigorously trained in the art of swordsmanship, and it was no surprise that many hailed her as the future guardian of the continent, alongside her older brother, Vert. Yet, despite her immense potential, her future took a tragic turn. Not long after she joined the Order of Light, she was gravely injured, keeled, as they called it, leaving her unable to fulfill her promising role. As Cyan held her in his arms, he felt a surge of emotion, the weight of missing her pressing down on him. His hug was tight, almost desperate, and it seemed to catch Ellis's attention. In that moment, he silently vowed to protect her this time, to ensure she never had to face the same fate again. Ellis, sensing the intensity of his embrace, pulled back slightly, her focus shifting. She glanced at Jurkin, her brow furrowing with confusion. "Are you the Duke's guardian knight?" she asked, surprised. "But the Duke just left for the war." Jurkin nodded, his expression serious yet gentle. "Yes, Lady Ellis. I've been given orders to protect the young master for the time being," he explained, though there was a hint of secrecy in his tone. "I cannot reveal everything, as I'm carrying out these orders in secret." Ever since he left the Duke's office, Cyan had felt a subtle presence following him. It nagged at him. Had Jurkin always been there, or had he just started trailing him? Cyan wondered why his father would have asked Jurkin to follow him in secret. The thought lingered in his mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by a wave of grogginess that overtook him without warning. Before Cyan could react, Ellis caught him just as he began to stumble, his eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion. She smiled softly, her voice gentle yet teasing. "You're still such a little kid, Cyan," she said, her tone laced with affection. The chaotic clash between siblings came to an end, giving way to a tranquil night. The cool evening air settled around them, carrying a sense of calm, while the stars above sparkled brilliantly, as if bearing silent witness to their reconciliation. The next morning, Ellis departed for the academy once more. Her visit had been brief, a fleeting stop to see their father before her graduation. Yet, in that short time, Cyan was reminded of how much he missed her presence. The emptiness she left behind only deepened his resolve. Alone in his study room, Cyan dropped to the floor and began his push-ups, his small body trembling with each repetition. For 2 weeks, he had thrown himself into rigorous strength training, determined to grow stronger. He knew he had to build himself up if he ever hoped to protect Ellis. But progress came slowly, agonizingly so. His arms burned, his chest ached, and after 10 push-ups, his strength gave out. Panting heavily, he collapsed onto the floor, frustration gnawing at him like a relentless beast. No matter how hard he pushed himself, it felt as though he'd hit an unyielding wall, unable to break through. Before his regression, Cyan had been confident in his physical strength. His body had been strong, well-defined and resilient. But now, everything felt different. His frailty, a stark reminder of how far he had to go. Silent tears streamed down his face as he wished for a fleeting moment that he could return to the past and reclaim his former self. This time, he knew he needed a new approach, a solution that would propel him beyond his current limits. As his thoughts churned, a sudden knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He wiped his face quickly and turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway was Emily, his maid, holding a package in her hands. Cyan rose to his feet and smiled warmly at the young maid. The package he had requested had arrived. Emily stood in the doorway, her face twisted in mild disgust as she pinched her nose with her fingers. "I hope you're happy with this," she muttered under her breath. In her hand was a small bottle, its contents unmistakable: hellhound's blood. The stench was overpowering, an odor so foul it lingered in the air, clinging to everything around it. Cyan had taken advantage of Ellis's guilt over their sparring match, asking her to send the bottle as a favor. Hellhound's blood was a rare substance, only found in the treacherous Lamia Valley. But Cyan had learned that it had also made its way into the black market, though most people avoided it. The blood of demon beasts was notoriously vile, reeking with a nauseating odor and causing a fierce, burning sensation in the mouth. With a grim expression, Cyan unscrewed the lid of the bottle. As he poured the thick, dark red liquid into a white bowl, bubbles began to form at the surface, adding to the already revolting sight. The smell intensified, filling the room with an almost suffocating stench. To most, this substance was considered a poison, deadly and volatile. What most people didn't know was that the blood of demonic beasts had the power to permanently enhance both physical and magical abilities when consumed. Though many dismissed it as a mere myth, Cyan knew better. In his previous life, he had witnessed the effects firsthand. His features darkened as he gazed at the bowl in his hands, and a sinister smile crept across his face. The knowledge of its power gave him a sense of grim satisfaction. Behind him, Emily stood, still pinching her nose in disgust, her face twisted in disbelief. "Are you really going to drink that, young master?" she wondered aloud, her voice tinged with both concern and revulsion. Cyan turned to her, his expression unwavering. "I will," he said confidently, his voice steady as he prepared to take the fateful step. Cyan reassured Emily with a calm glance, telling her not to worry as he brought the hellhound's blood to his lips. He thought to himself that if he could stomach her cooking, he could endure this foul liquid. He remembered the first dish she ever made for him, supposed to be mushroom soup. The sight of it had almost stopped his heart, and after the first spoonful, he was certain he'd never taste anything worse. Yet, compared to that, hellhound's blood wasn't so bad. In fact, he found it almost tolerable. He drank it all, his eyes narrowing in concentration. As the last drop slid down his throat, a surge of raw power rushed through his veins, and his eyes glowed a deep crimson. A sense of strength, unlike anything he'd felt before, spread through his body. He wiped the blood from his mouth, the strange new energy pulsing within him. Emily watched him from behind, her brow furrowed in disgust as she took in the scene, unable to mask her distaste for what she had just witnessed. The energy surged within him, radiating outward as every muscle and vein hummed with newfound strength. "That's good," he murmured, his voice calm and steady, despite the intensity of the sensation coursing through him. He rose to his feet, feeling the power rush through his body, a dark crimson aura swirling around him. His eyes burned with a fierce determination as he turned toward Emily. "I'm going out for a walk," he said, his gaze unwavering and resolute. Cyan wanted to test if the hellhound's blood had truly increased his strength. He stepped outside, the crisp air of the duchy filling his lungs as he made his way toward a familiar mountain overlooking the land. It had been a while since he last visited this place. For the past 2 weeks, he'd been waiting for this moment, when Yurkin was away and the usual reports were absent. It was his time to be alone, to gather his thoughts and explore. As Cyan trudged along the muddy roads of the mountain, his thoughts drifted to another matter entirely. He recalled a memory from his previous life. Ashel, his brother's closest companion, had received a divine revelation from Lumendel, the god of light. The message spoke of an ancient temple hidden deep in the backwoods of Velius. The temple's entrance was said to lie somewhere nearby, though its exact location had eluded all who searched for it. Cyan continued walking, his eyes scanning the land, searching for any clue that might lead him to it. At first, he hadn't believed the story. It had sounded like just another grand tale, another myth to add to the endless stories of gods and legends. But as he focused his senses, something shifted. He crouched down, placing a hand on the ground, and felt it. There was something here. A faint but unmistakable concentration of mana flowing through the earth beneath his fingers. In that moment, Cyan knew it was real. The entrance was close. And though he knew that in this life his brother had yet to receive the revelation, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anticipation. Cyan's expression darkened, a twisted smile spreading across his face as the whites of his teeth gleamed. His hand extended forward, and dark crimson mana surged from his fingers, swirling in the air like a living shadow. In this life, only he knew the secret hidden within the divine revelation, and that knowledge filled him with a sense of dark triumph. As his palm made contact with the ground, his aura intensified. The earth beneath his hand trembled and cracked, crumbling away as a path began to form before him. His eyes gleamed with a sinister light as he imagined how Ashel would never, in his wildest dreams, suspect what Cyan was truly plotting. Not yet, anyway. A low, ominous rumble reverberated through the air, growing louder as the earth itself began to split. With a final, violent crack, the ground shattered, revealing an underground passage, long forgotten and hidden for centuries. As Cyan descended into the dark passage, a strange sensation washed over him. The air felt heavier, thicker than he remembered, as though the energy of the place had grown more potent since the last time he'd been here. Every step made his pulse quicken, a subtle reminder that this was no ordinary place. Hands tucked casually into his pockets, Cyan's gaze wandered the dimly lit path, his mind drifting to his past life before the regression. This was an ancient temple, once devoted to Lumendel, the god of light, a sacred site now shrouded in mystery and nearly forgotten by time. Its history was a somber one. Centuries ago, during the devastating Demon War, the temple had been destroyed, its legacy erased in the chaos. The conflict left scars too deep to mend, burying not just the temple, but the memories of its divine purpose beneath layers of time and ash. As Cyan descended the long, narrow steps, his eyes caught a peculiar golden light emanating from the shrine ahead. The glow pierced through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the pathway and casting soft, flickering shadows on the ancient stone walls. His expression remained neutral, but inwardly, his thoughts churned. Who would have imagined that such a sacred site could lie hidden in the mountains right behind the castle? The realization that it had always been in his own backyard, in the secluded backwoods, was almost laughable. As he approached the radiating golden light, his gaze settled on the weapon resting within the shrine. It seemed to pulse with an ethereal brilliance, as though alive, commanding reverence with its presence. The weapon appeared less like an object and more like the temple's rightful master, a relic infused with divine power, waiting patiently for its chosen wielder. Cyan's thoughts wandered through the annals of history. It was the year 999 SC, before the dawn of the Foundation era, on a fateful August 12th, when humanity achieved its greatest victory, driving the Demon King's formidable army out of Velius. The odds had been insurmountable. The Demon King's forces, far superior in strength and strategy, seemed invincible. Yet, against all expectations, humanity prevailed. The turning point had come with the discovery of ancient relics known as the gods' weaponry. These sacred artifacts imbued their wielders with divine power, enabling them to defy the impossible. Of all the legendary relics, none was more revered than Duran Dark, the holy sword blessed by Lumendel, the god of light. This blade of celestial brilliance had become a symbol of humanity's triumph, a weapon of divine justice that cleaved through darkness and despair. But for Cyan, the sword's legacy was a bitter one. In his past life, it wasn't a symbol of salvation, but the instrument of his downfall. Wielded by a shell with righteous fervor, Duran Dark had brought his life to an end, humiliating, pitiful, and final. The memory of its gleaming edge haunted him even now, fueling his determination to rewrite the course of destiny. Cyan couldn't shake the thought that Duran Dark might somehow be tied to his inexplicable regression. The idea gnawed at him, an uneasy mix of curiosity and lingering bitterness. Unable to resist, he extended a hand toward the sword. His fingers brushed against its hilt, and as he had expected, nothing happened. No divine resonance, no surge of power. Just cold, unyielding metal. Disappointment twisted into frustration, and his irritation flared. In a petty act of defiance, Cyan kicked the tip of the blade, his voice laced with biting sarcasm as he muttered, "Holy sword, my ass." The encounter had soured his mood entirely. Whatever secrets the sword held, they seemed unwilling to reveal themselves to him. With a resigned sigh, he decided to finish what he had come for and leave this place behind. Yet, as he turned to go, the sword hummed faintly. Unbeknownst to Cyan, Duran Dark was far from indifferent to his mockery. As Cyan turned to step beyond the altar's golden glow, an unsettling shift stopped him in his tracks. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a shadow, an unnatural one that seemed to move of its own accord. At first, he assumed it was merely the sword's shadow, cast by the radiant light of the shrine. But as he looked closer, unease crept in. This wasn't an ordinary shadow. Where there is light, there must also be darkness, and this darkness was alive. A sinister red mist began to seep from the shadow's edges, twisting and curling like smoke from an unseen fire. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive force that sent shivers down Cyan's spine. Crouching down, he examined it more closely. The crimson mist carried a suffocating aura, one that could easily be mistaken for the sword's divine influence. But Cyan knew better. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, a glint of dark excitement flickering in his eyes. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. This was no ordinary shadow. This was something deeper, something hidden within the light itself, a darkness far more fascinating than the holy radiance that tried to conceal it. Cyan placed both hands firmly on the ground where the red mist swirled, channeling his mana into the peculiar shadow. The energy flowed from him, dark and unrelenting, merging with the ominous mist. As the ground beneath him began to tremble, Cyan's thoughts turned inward, a quiet realization echoing in his mind. Where there is light, there will always be darkness, hidden in the glow of the altar. The ground responded to his mana, shifting and unraveling as if a veil had been lifted. Slowly, a hidden path revealed itself, concealed for centuries behind the radiant altar. A dimly lit doorway materialized, its presence an unspoken secret, lost to time. Cyan stepped forward, each movement deliberate, until he reached the door and pushed it open. What greeted him was a stark contrast to the divine brilliance of the outer chamber. The room was cloaked in shadow, dark and hollow, exuding an aura of foreboding. At its center stood another pedestal, this one holding a short dagger, levitating as if untouched by the weight of time. Unlike the golden glow of the divine sword, this weapon radiated a strange, otherworldly pink aura, pulsating faintly like a heartbeat. Cyan's lips curled into a pleased smile. The sight of the dagger was both familiar and exhilarating. He recognized it instantly and felt a surge of dark anticipation. Cyan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he reached out to place a hand on the crimson blade. His fingers brushed against its surface, and a wicked grin spread across his face. It had been far too long. The weapon responded instantly, its dark aura igniting in a fierce, pulsating flare. This was Kiram, the demonic sword he had wielded in his previous life, the blade that had once been an extension of his very soul. The air grew heavy as the aura surged, wild and untamed, wrapping around Cyan like a shadowy shroud. He swung the dagger a few times, slicing effortlessly through the air. The movements felt natural, instinctive, as though no time had passed since he had last held it. The weapon's power hummed in his grip, resonating with his own dark energy. As he extended the short dagger before him, a sly grin tugged at his lips. With a tone of mock cheerfulness, he greeted the blade with casual defiance, his voice laced with familiarity. "Good morning, Kiram." Cyan casually slid one hand into his pocket, his gaze fixed on the dagger in his other hand. When the blade remained silent, unresponsive, a faint frown crept across his face. Kiram must still be dormant, he thought, her power yet to stir. Tilting his head slightly, he considered his options before gripping the hilt tighter. With a deliberate motion, he began to swing the dagger through the air, each arc more forceful than the last, as if the sheer intensity might rouse her from her slumber. A warmth crept into Cyan's cheeks, a faint blush betraying the surge of emotions stirring within him. The dagger's familiar, intoxicating presence awakened a fire he had almost forgotten, a sensation that coursed through him like an unspoken craving. For the first time in this new life, he felt truly alive, his blood thrumming with a restless need to test Kiram's power. An itch began to grow, gnawing at his thoughts. He needed a target, something to unleash this rekindled strength upon. Anything would do. As Cyan basked in the moment, a shadow pooled beneath him, shifting and twisting until it formed sharp, predatory eyes that locked onto him with an unrelenting glare. From the depths of the shadow came a deep, resonant voice, dripping with menace. "You're quite the daring boy, aren't you?" it growled. "Do you even understand the price of waking me?" Cyan paused mid-swing, the dagger frozen in his grip as he met the shadow's gaze. His expression remained calm, almost indifferent, a faint trace of amusement playing on his lips. "Fear? Not exactly," he replied, his voice carrying a lazy nonchalance, as though the ominous presence before him was hardly worth his concern. With a dismissive shrug, he tilted his head slightly, his tone laced with mock confidence. "And as for the price, I'm going to assume it means this dagger is mine now." The shadow pulsed, expanding into a larger, more menacing form, its edges rippling with malice. "Ignorant fool," it hissed, its voice dripping with disdain. "You've awakened a demonic blade. Regret will do you no good now. It's far too late." As the shadow writhed, it twisted into a grotesque visage, a ghastly grin stretching across its shape, revealing jagged, razor-sharp teeth. "Your body will be mine," it snarled, before surging forward with feral intensity, a whirlwind of darkness and fury, hurtling straight towards Cyan. Before the shadow could strike, Cyan acted with unerring precision. His hand lashed out, seizing the shadow by the throat in a single, fluid motion. The creature halted mid-attack, its ferocity giving way to a stunned stillness as Cyan's grip tightened with an iron resolve. His expression remained calm, almost indifferent as he muttered, "You talk too much." For a fleeting moment, Cyan's thoughts flickered with curiosity. He didn't remember Kirim ever being this reckless. The shadow writhed and clawed at his unyielding grip, its once imposing aura flickering like a dying flame. The obsidian black exterior began to peel away, revealing a humanoid face beneath the darkness. For the first time, it wasn't Cyan who seemed taken aback, it was Kirim. The demonic blade stirred with unease as white ichor dripped from the shadow's mouth, pooling beneath them like a quiet lament. Kirim gasped, her voice laced with disbelief as she stammered, demanding to know who Cyan was. Her expression twisted with confusion, her sharp eyes darting to his hand still firmly clasped around her throat. "How can you touch me?" she hissed, her voice trembling with both anger and unease. Cyan's lips curled into a smirk, his tone calm, yet carrying an undeniable finality. "Simple, I told you, you belong to me." Kirim's eyes flared with fury as a low growl escaped her lips. Her nails extended into vicious razor-sharp claws, glinting like deadly blades. "Get lost!" she shrieked, lashing out with a sudden ferocity. The unexpected attack forced Cyan to release her grip, his fingers falling away as Kirim leaped back with a predatory elegance. Her presence radiated danger, her stance poised and ready for another strike. Despite the sudden shift, Cyan remained composed, his neutral expression unshaken, his eyes locked on hers with unwavering confidence. The shadow coalesced into a striking figure, a woman of otherworldly beauty and lethal elegance. Her movements carried a predatory grace, and an aura of danger seemed to ripple off her in waves. Kirim's sharp eyes narrowed as she studied him, her voice edged with suspicion. "Who are you?" she demanded, her elongated claws still poised for a strike, her posture tense and wary, like a cornered beast ready to pounce, her piercing gaze fixed on the dark aura swirling around him, her tone sharp and questioning. "You're shrouded in something, twisted. Are you the successor?" Her eyes narrowed further, suspicion deepening. "Why do I sense air's presence within you?" Cyan's grin widened, the gleam in his eyes unmistakably devilish. "You've hit the mark," he replied, his voice rich with unshakable confidence. "I am air's successor. Your master has returned." He stepped forward, his presence commanding as the air grew colder around him. "Now bow, Kirim. Your master has returned," he ordered, his voice carrying an icy authority that left no room for defiance. Kirim recoiled, her expression darkening as her brows twitched in defiance. Fury and disbelief mingled in her voice as she spat, "You're just a snot-nosed child." Her tone trembled, her denial palpable. "I won't accept this." With a piercing scream, she lunged at him, claws slashing through the air with wild precision. Sparks danced across the room as Cyan parried her frenzied attacks effortlessly, his every movement sharp and calculated. He sighed inwardly, realizing that words would never reach her. Of course, he mused grimly, a demonic sword exists to dominate its wielder, not serve them willingly. As Kiram unleashed another relentless strike, Cyan's lips curved into a menacing grin, his demeanor shifting to something far darker. He leapt back, creating a gap between them, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper. "All right then, let's do this your way." With a flick of his wrist, a surge of dark energy coursed through him. "Sword manipulation," he intoned, activating demonic sword control. The air around him crackled with power, the room dimming as shadows twisted and danced at his command. Kiram froze mid-strike as an unseen force dragged her to the ground with crushing intensity. A sharp groan escaped her lips as the impact reverberated through her body. Struggling against the invisible power pinning her, her sharp nails clawed at the ground, leaving deep gouges. She glared up at Cyan with gritted teeth, disbelief flickering in her furious eyes. How could this child know the ancient incantation to restrain her? Cyan stood over her, his expression cold and tinged with mockery. Despite her predicament, Kiram continued to resist, refusing to acknowledge him as her master. With unshaken resolve, Cyan called out sword manipulation once more. The force intensified, driving her head closer to the ground, her growls of defiance filling the air. Her claws scraped violently against the floor as she struggled to rise, but Cyan remained unrelenting. He invoked sword manipulation again, and this time, the pressure was unbearable, forcing half of her body into the ground. Kiram's resistance began to waver, her growls turning to strained gasps. Finally, she relented, her voice dripping with bitterness as she muttered her submission. But the insolence in her tone didn't sit well with Cyan. His cold gaze hardened as he prepared to invoke sword manipulation once more, his voice steady and unyielding. Before he could finish the incantation, Kiram broke, her voice trembling with reluctant sincerity. "I accept you as my master," she said, her tone carrying a mix of exhaustion and defeat. Satisfied, Cyan released his grip, stepping back as Kiram pulled herself free from the earth. Dusting his hands off, he surveyed the temple. His mission was complete, and it was time to leave. He had been gone long enough. People would start to notice his absence soon enough. He turned, Kiram's dagger form solid in his grasp. The red mist swirled around his hand, her presence still lingering. Kiram's voice echoed from the blade, a chuckle escaping her. "It's been ages since I've felt fresh air," she mused, her tone unexpectedly light, almost playful. Before Cyan could reply, a strange black mass emerged from the sword, a quirky blob with glowing eyes, a wide mouth, and messy pink hair. The creature bobbed cheerfully in the air, its voice giddy with delight. "Ah, refreshing," it exclaimed, spinning in circles as though it had just woken from a long slumber. The wisp danced around Cyan, Kiram's curious gaze fixed on him. She hovered near his shoulder before asking with innocent wonder, "What's your name?" Cyan, unbothered, didn't glance back. He continued walking, his voice steady and calm. "Cyan Vert." Kiram tilted her head, clearly perplexed. She had never heard of the name Cyan Vert before, and a flicker of doubt crossed her features. With a raised brow, she asked, "Was Air really foolish enough to choose someone like you as the next successor? You're just a kid." Cyan didn't break his stride, his gaze fixed ahead. With quiet confidence, he confirmed, "Air did indeed choose me to be the successor, though that was before my regression in my previous life." The mention of a previous life made Kiram pause. Her confusion deepened. Previous life? She couldn't wrap her mind around what he meant by that. Cyan, sensing the conversation could spiral into more confusion, simply shrugged and added, "I died once before." Kiram floated silently, her confusion deepening as she tried to grasp the strange things Cyan was saying. Who was he really? After a moment, her gaze drifted to the floating divine sword. She muttered under her breath that it was still asleep. Cyan had stopped in front of the sword, his eyes fixed on its hilt. He knew the sword's master wouldn't show up for another 20 years, and that thought stirred something dark within him. Kiram ground her teeth, her curiosity piqued. She asked, "Do you know something about the sword that I don't?" Cyan didn't answer her, his focus now entirely on the dagger in his hand. With a swift motion, he swung it at the hilt of the divine sword, catching the hilt with his other hand. The sword fell with a deafening crash, its metal echoing through the chamber, leaving Kiram stunned. "What are you going to do?" she asked, voice tinged with disbelief. A maniacal grin spread across Cyan's face as he looked down at the broken piece of the holy sword in his hand. He knew that holding on to even a fragment of the divine sword would make things far more interesting for him down the line.